Hi, I'm Tom McMillan, a historian with Gettysburg History, and we're going to talk about how the Star Spangled Banner, the original flag from Fort McHenry that inspired the national anthem, that story is tied to Gettysburg. How is that possible? Well, Gettysburg is the greatest little history town in America. It's tied to everything. It certainly is here through the Armistead family and through Francis Scott Key. If you watch the movie Gettysburg, you know there's a scene just before Pickett's charge where the British Army officer Arthur Freemantle is talking to Lewis Armistead. And he says to Armistead, "I understand you're from an illustrious military family." And Armistead kind of grunts. And Freemantle says, "They tell me that it was your uncle who defended Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 and therefore was the guardian of the original Star Spangled Banner." And he looks across the field to Cemetery Ridge where American flags are fluttering before Pickett's charge, and he says, "I do appreciate the irony of it all." And it really struck me that here you have, half a century apart, one man defended the Star Spangled Banner, and 50 years later, his nephew, Lewis Armistead was George's nephew, fights against the United States, really, in Pickett's charge, against that flag. A rather stunning assessment. But it's not, that isn't the only tie. In researching the Armistead family, George Armistead got command of Fort McHenry in 1813, a year before the battle that led to the Star Spangled Banner. And he was a career military man. He always had this thing for gigantic flags. And they were wary of a British attack even back then in 1813. And Armistead wanted a flag so large the British couldn't help but see it from a distance. It gets to September of 1814. It's clear the British are now going to attack Fort McHenry. George Armistead is in charge. He is worried in particular because his wife, Louisa, is almost 9 months pregnant with their second child. He wants to get her out of Baltimore, out of that tense situation. Where does he send her? 60 miles away to a little farming community in Pennsylvania named Gettysburg. No, he couldn't have picked that randomly, could he? I don't think so. There's never been a specific trail of why this happened. None of the history books mention it, but in doing some research, I found a letter that George Armistead wrote to his wife when she was in Gettysburg. And he mentions, give greetings to Mrs. Stewart. There was, in fact, a Stewart family that lived on York Street. Margaret Stewart lived there in 1814. Her husband, William, had died before that, shortly after the census was taken, but he had business ties to Baltimore, so that makes sense. We can't prove it for sure, but this is one where 2 + 2 might equal 4. Armistead would not have sent his pregnant wife just to a random town with nobody he knew. So I think because it was a Baltimore connection, and he mentioned Mrs. Stewart, they stayed on York Street. Again, we'll never know for sure. And Armistead, about a month after the battle, writes to a fellow soldier, "I'm going to Gettysburg to get my wife and meet my new child." So that's the Armistead connection. Obviously, he could not have known that some 50 years later, his nephew would be fighting on the fields of Pickett's charge. Now, what about the other connection with Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star Spangled Banner? Key had been on a ship. He'd been on a mercy mission to try to free an old prisoner, and the battle was going to take place, so the British would not release him. So he watched that battle from a ship under British guard in the harbor. And the next morning, he wasn't sure who had won the battle. There was a lot of smoke, there was a lot of rain, and he saw the American flag. At 9 a.m., there had been at Fort McHenry, it was a traditional flag-raising ceremony, but this one was different. The soldiers were firing guns and playing music and taunting the British, and this is when Armistead's huge flag went up, and that's the moment Key saw it and inspired him to write the words of the Star Spangled Banner. Key was a lawyer. He was also licensed to practice in Pennsylvania. And in the 1830s, and we have this in the collection of Gettysburg history in the Adams County Historical Society, it's in the Beyond the Battle Museum, we have manumission papers that Key filed here in Gettysburg for one of his older enslaved people, Clem Johnson. I believe Clem was in his mid-40s. Key wanted to free him. Maryland was still a slave state, obviously. He brings him to the free state of Pennsylvania to free him. Interestingly enough, the story is that although the document says that Clem was a free man now, could stay in Pennsylvania, he liked Key so much, he went back with Key to Maryland and worked with him for a wage for the rest of his life. So those are the two perhaps thin but intriguing connections of how Gettysburg is tied to the story of the original Star Spangled Banner.